We have 47 minutes total. It's about 45 minutes from right now. So we're going to go ahead and jump in. There will be some people joining as we continue, but bored to death. We're going to talk about some ways you can revitalize your board meeting. Here's an overview of where we're going to be going today. We'll talk about the 7 horizons of focus, time management for board meetings, governance or not. And then finally, we'll talk about how silence equals disagreement, or maybe how it should. A lot of these concepts today are going to be coming from the Intentional Board, written by our co-host Kent Stroman. If you would like a copy of that, I'll drop a website in the chat box right now. Feel free to pick up a copy if you'd like that. A lot of the content's going to be coming from there. We have some other resources that we'll give you in that chat box throughout the webinar this morning. If you have questions, feel free to use the chat box. We will have some time at the end to do some Q&R, question and response. And we are going to.
And just leave our doors open too, so then we'll see him.
We're going to jump into it. Before I hand things over to Kent, for right now, if you could mute yourself, we'll give Kent the microphone and see if he'll jump into the 7 horizons of focus for us.
7 horizons of focus. And what does this have to do with bored to death? So one of the things we found really in every organization, there are these 7 horizons of focus. Horizon number 1 is what's in the past. And think about your board meeting for a minute. What do we do that's focused behind us? Well, essentially, everything that has the word report attached to it is historical information. So, for example, we look at the secretary's report, the minutes, the treasurer's report, the financial statements, reports from committees and from officers and so forth. All of these are descriptions of historical events or occasions, and it's all behind us. And so actually, I'm going to do a real quick poll on the screen. And before we do, let me ask everybody if you'll just get your hands up. We're going to do some physical exercises here real quick. Raise the roof, get it going. Okay, hands down. And so by show of hands, how many would say that in board meetings you feel like sometimes you spend more time on reports than what maybe is necessary? Just by show of hands. We spend a lot of time, maybe too much time. Okay, really quite a few. Well, so we say the past deserves a glance, but not a gaze. So yeah, we want to glance at the rearview mirror, but we don't want to drive by the rearview mirror. So horizon number 1 is what's past. Horizon number 2, that's what's now. And we look around, where are we in the present? Horizon number 3 is what's next, and then horizon number 4 is what's after what's next. So in terms of context, for now, let's consider that to be the current month. What's next is the remainder of this fiscal year. And let's say horizon number 4 is our next fiscal year. And to a large degree, horizons 2, 3, and 4, for the most part, the die is cast. Most of us aren't going to see, in most cases in a boardroom, the action we take today isn't going to have a substantial effect on what happens today or this year, or to a certain degree, the following year. So that's horizons 2, 3, and 4. Now, if we look at 5, 6, and 7, horizon number 5, that's where we're thinking about an organization in generative terms. What could be? What could we accomplish as an organization? What should our long-term perspective be? So horizon 5 is very, very broad. When we go from 5 to 6, we move from what could be to should be. So we say, anything could happen, but for our organization, for this next season, and think about a time frame where we're looking out 3, 4, maybe 5 years, what should be. And then in horizon number 7, here we're talking about what will be. So we're becoming very focused, especially in a boardroom. This is not only our strategic direction, but our strategic destination. So that asks the question, kind of what do we want to be when we grow up? When do we want to grow up, and what will that look like? So consider using these 7 horizons to evaluate your board meeting, and even in some ways to calibrate the board meeting. So anyhow, 7 horizons. This is one of the core pieces of the framework in the intentional board. Aaron, any dimensions there that you wanted to touch on that we haven't covered yet as it relates to the 7 horizons?
I don't think so. I think that's a good framework for our next section. I don't know if you're ready to move past that, if you want to hang out there, but gives great ideas on conceptually what we should focus on in our meeting. 2 questions that we can do a little comparison and contrast to when we think about our own board meeting. So make a mental audit of your last meeting and ask yourself, how should you be spending the most time in board meetings? And then compare that to how should you spend most of the time in board meetings. And if there's a gap here, we can think about identifying the gap and identifying the gap. That's identifying the problem. That's maybe half of the solution is, okay, let's identify the problem, but then how do we solve the problem? And there's the other half of the effort that we need to put forth. And this may sound somewhat elementary or basic, but on this next slide, this is a great practice that not all boards utilize. Use a thoughtfully prepared, timed agenda for every meeting. And typically, we would encourage the board chair to be the one taking the lead on this. But think through what is your meeting going to look like? Maybe everyone's used or is familiar with a zero balance budget, where before you get your paycheck, you decide where every dollar is going to go so that when you do get paid, it's already accounted for and you just put the dollars to work. You save some, you pay the bills, et cetera, et cetera. Think of your agenda for your board meeting as kind of a zero balance when it comes to time, zero balance budget for your board meeting. What are you going to spend each minute doing? And then go ahead and make the plan and stick to it as best you can. Now you see there's a template for an agenda out of the Intentional Board, the book. I'm going to drop a link in our chat box. If you would like to download a template, it's exactly that. It's a template. It's not the one final solution for all board meetings, but this might be a good way to approach your next board meeting, is by taking a look at this template and going through it. And again, as we look at the 7 horizons, you want most of your meeting to be focused on the future, not on the past. The past is already done. Sometimes we need to acknowledge it, admit it, accept it, but we need to think about the future. If I'm sitting in a board meeting and we've spent more than 20 minutes, 20 minutes talking about things in the past, that's a little bit of a red flag to me, going, okay, this isn't a good direction for the board meeting. I'm getting a little nervous at this point. One of the recommendations that you'll catch in the Intentional Board is, if there are some minutes, some items that just need to be approved on by the board, if you can put multiple items and pass all of those under a single vote, that's a great way to save time. To deal with what's in the past, go ahead and deal with it, but then to move forward.
Hey, Aaron, let's do another quick kind of visual poll here. And on the template you see on the line at 10:07 is the consent agenda. And I'm just curious, by show of hands, how many of you would say in the board meetings that you're presently involved with that the consent agenda is used on a regular basis, just by show of hands? Great, great. Real quick in the chat box, those that aren't using that practice, I would love to see your thoughts about what the obstacles are, maybe why the consent agenda isn't being used on a regular basis. And I'll scan those, but Aaron, go ahead. I just wanted to kind of get an idea of where people were in that particular practice.
So let's go to the next slide. This is just a great practice for the board chair, or for if he's not leading, he or she's not leading the meeting, someone else. But manage the agenda, don't manage people. And when I say this, it's easy to get sidetracked. You have an agenda item, we start talking about it, but oh, that reminds me of this other thing that we had talked about a couple months ago, and we start chasing the rabbit, right? We get off and distracted. Instead of trying to manage people, stay focused on the agenda. The leader might come back and say, hey, that's something that is worthy of conversation. Once this agenda item is taken care of, make a note with the secretary, it will come back to that, but let's stay focused on this agenda item until the group comes to a place where a decision needs to be made, a motion needs to be made, there's a consensus, but staying focused. And again, Kent talked about this earlier, but we're going to focus on what's on the past or what's on the future on one of those horizons. And law number 8 in the intentional board is the law of expansion, and whatever we focus on expands. That's why we don't want to focus too much on reports, because that's just going to expand and grow bigger. However, if we do focus on pushing the mission forward, we think, okay, what's the next strategic step this organization needs to take, and how do we get there? That is going to be what expands. And that type of productivity is what makes a boardroom really, really come to life. Now, we can kind of categorize items in the boardroom into one of two areas. And so I'll hand this back over to you, and maybe you can take us through what board should be focused on.
Yeah, so I don't know about you guys, but I always bristle just a little bit when somebody comes up and, everybody in the world falls into 3 categories, right? But I'm going to do that for just a minute here. So here's what we found is that regardless of the type of organization, whether it's a charitable organization like those that are represented here today, corporate, business, education, whatever, there's 5 roles. And I'm not going to go into depth on this, but if you think about 5 functions in every organization, there's governance, leadership, management, micromanagement, execution, and they all matter, right? They're all important. Here are some activities that fall within each of those categories. And then on the right-hand side, you see who that activity is assigned to. And again, the point on here is that it takes all different kinds of functions and activities to move any organization forward. But one distinction that I want to draw, you'll notice that the top line is in green. So the role of governing, which is to establish the mission, the direction, establish policy, to assess performance against policy, all of that is the responsibility of the board. So we call that governance. And so if you think about it, everything falls into 1 or 2 categories. One is governance. The other one, this is a very highly technical term that I came up with myself. It's called not governance. So, I mean, think about it. In the boardroom, if it's governance, it belongs. If it's not governance, it should be moved outside of the boardroom. And so just to kind of reiterate, everything is either governance or not governance. So when you think about this whole theme of board to death, the reason board meetings become laborious, wearisome, and sometimes even contentious. Oftentimes, it's, we talked about one thing is we're too focused on the past. The other thing oftentimes is we're focused on that which is outside our purview. So again, it has to do with execution, management, micromanagement, or even leadership. Ideally, that should be left under the purview of the CEO. If it's governance, keep it in the board. If it's not governance, keep it outside the boardroom. And so maybe before we go on, Aaron, we're just a couple of minutes ahead of schedule. Anybody have thoughts or questions with respect to the whole idea of governance, not governance, and keeping it in the board or pushing it outside the boardroom? Anybody have a thought, comment, question?
As people are coming up with that question, we did get a request to show the previous slide again.
How's that? Is that the right one?
I think so. Let's keep it there. Let some people do
Sure.
screenshots. And if anyone wants more of this, feel free to email either one of us. I'll make sure I get that to you. I'll go ahead and ask a question that I know Maggie mentioned, and Lydia's kind of she said, any suggestions for an organization that has no full-time employees or CEO? I know some of our organizations, they have what we might call an operational board, a board that's involved in some of those lead, manage, micromanage, and execute fashions. What would you say for boards, maybe, or younger organizations that are growing, don't have paid staff yet, or whose board members are governing but also fulfilling the mission? Any insight there?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. And two suggestions I'd have. Number one is to do the assessment and recognize where you are. And then number two, identify your aspirations. And so just because we are where we are, that doesn't mean that's necessarily where we want to be. And so if we can have some clear aspirations, it'll help us to be able to navigate from where we are to where we want to be. The other thing, which I think helps on that, is to the question says no full-time employees / CEO. I find it helpful to think about staff, some of whom may be paid and some who are unpaid. Okay, so oftentimes I'm looking at Jan Pride. Hello, Jan. But I know in her organization, they have people on staff who are actually paid. They have other people who do staff work on a volunteer basis, and so those are unpaid staff. By contrast, we have volunteers who are doing governance work, and sometimes that same person is also doing execution work. And so one of the things that's really helpful, I think, is for the person who's in that volunteer role to ask themselves at that moment, which hat am I wearing? So if a member of the board is, let's say, doing a teaching exercise at Happy Hands, okay, in that moment, they are not performing as a member of the governance team. They're actually performing in a staff role, and they're being supervised either directly or indirectly by Jan or somebody else on her staff. And so, if I'm a board member and I'm mowing the grass, that's a volunteer staff person who is also on occasion serving in the boardroom. That's
great. Deborah just commented, I think boards can get off track on what is governance. This is helpful information to stay on track. It'd be helpful to have an onboarding of board members that help set expectations. Yes. And the idea of putting the hats on, I mean, it's ideal, I think, if a board member also wants to volunteer and, on some level outside the boardroom and, go to the camp or the hospital and put in some volunteer hours. But it is important to know which hat they're wearing, and for both the board member and the other staff people or other people, because that can that can get sticky if you try to wear too many hats at the same time. But great distinction. And back up to Lydia, I think one of the toughest growing pains for a nonprofit organization is to take that leap where you have the CEO or founder working kind of two jobs at the same time, to go full on and be a full-time paid staff person with the nonprofit. It's one of the most difficult steps to take, but it's one of the most fruitful, and one of our favorite steps that we like to help organizations make. Because then, man, when you can have at least that first full-time person focused on mission, the traction and momentum you get is just fantastic.
Yeah, and Jan makes the comment about written policies. Absolutely agreed. And when you pair that with the earlier comment about onboarding, we could easily do a 47-minute webinar just on the topic of some effective ways to go about the onboarding. Here's the thing. I wouldn't worry about it getting it perfect, but I would kind of leverage Jan's idea, and that is just put it in writing. This is what's important in the onboarding process. And by the way, responsibility for onboarding staff members resides with the board, not with the staff, not even with the CEO. And a lot of times in the CEO role, we say, well, if I don't do it, nobody will do it. And another way to look at that is that if I do it, nobody else will do it. Mm-hmm. And so look for opportunities to keep the responsibility for board stuff in the boardroom. And with that, Aaron, let's go ahead and move to that topic about.
Yeah, let's throw the question up there on slide 12. What signs of disengagement have you seen in the boardroom? I'd love for people just to drop in the chat box. Have you seen people disengage in the boardroom? Probably all of us have. What does that look like? What has it looked like? Maybe it's a current thing and you don't need to mention any names or get too specific with it, but what signs of disengagement have you seen in the boardroom? This is a red flag. If people start to disengage during a board meeting, not good. Some of this.
Hey, Aaron, I'll give you one.
Yeah, exactly. When they're paying attention to the phone more than to the meeting, or sometimes if two people are on the cell phone and it's like, you just know they're texting each other and they're having a meeting outside the meeting. Not a good sign.
Well, how about the one where the phone rings and they answer it in the room, loud?
Okay, so we see many glaze over during financials. Yeah, the glaze over look, falling asleep is one.
Is this theoretical?
Yeah, literally no feedback during the meeting. When board members stop talking, and we're going to address that. Coming late, leaving early, not paying attention, not attending, not making it a commitment. And the whole now it's like Zoom board meetings are a thing, and that's that's a disengagement on some level, not even intentional. But
did somebody just call out people who don't have their cameras turned on?
Turning off cameras, yeah.
Come on, you guys, turn on your cameras.
Hey, this is not a board meeting that we're in. This is a webinar,
okay.
So I think
we get a pass.
Multitasking right now. But so if we go to the next slide, we've added this law in the we have 17 laws of the intentional board. We added an 18th law, and it's the law of dead air. And this goes huge, not just in board meetings, but if you're a CEO on the call, you can utilize this in staff meetings. If you're married, you can utilize this in a conversation with the spouse. I mean, this is a huge principle, but silence equals disagreement. Silence equals disagreement. And what?
Ooh, how do you mean that, Aaron?
Yeah, so let me unpack this. A lot of times in a meeting, there might be an agenda item or a topic come up, and maybe there's two people that are verbal about it. One's for it, one's against it, and everyone else is silent. It's easy to interpret that silence as some sort of agreement or consensus. In fact, the next slide says silent gives consent. and that's a quote by Common Knowledge. The idea that if we're silent, whatever's on the table is going to move forward. And if we interpret silence as agreement, then it's just gonna happen. That's not intentional. If we go back to the idea that silence is disagreement, this changes things. And this is a great practice and assumption for the board chair to make, that if I'm the board chair and I see that Susie and John are both being silent, I'm going to make sure that I address them. Susie, John, I've noticed you're both disagreeing. You're both being silent. I would like to hear why you disagree, and get some words that can articulate whatever's going on in the brain. And so, too often than not, we just assume like, okay, the person's being silent, they must not care, they're just going with the flow. But to treat that as disagreement, hey, we're not going to move past this until, whatever, we've reached the vote or had a full dialogue about it at least. This gives everyone a voice, and it's important that everyone at least speaks into the matter at hand, because we're in a board meeting and we're talking about the future. So these are things that matter. It's easy.
So Aaron, is disagreement a bad thing?
No, disagreement is healthy. It's important, because you never want to make a decision and then someone look back and go, yeah, I was never for that. I could have told you. I would, I was thinking. It's like, that doesn't do anybody any good. And especially introverts, they process in their mind before they speak it out loud. They think to speak, whereas extroverts speak to think. And so it's easy for the extrovert or the dominant personality to really take over the conversation. But it's important for that meeting leader, the board chair, to give everyone a voice, because the quiet, soft-spoken person who's not going to interrupt still has some weighty contribution to bring to the table. Yeah. And this is a great practice to make sure that all perspectives are being heard, that all the great thoughts that are in the heads of all the wonderful leaders around the table get voiced. And too often, people will disengage because either they're not given that chance to speak, they're not called on, or they're silent and think that their voice doesn't matter. So we want to make sure that we're listening to everyone at the table.
Yeah. So Aaron, Jerry posed a question here. Is the goal consensus? Is the goal consensus? I'd love to see some people respond to that in the chat box. And I think it really is an excellent practice for us to know what the goal is. Quick story. I'm in a board meeting. There was a guy who was prone to do what I'm prone to do, and he had dozed off. He was deep in thought on another planet. There was a topic that was up for a vote, and the chair called for a vote. And when that happened, it startled him. And here's what happened. He opened his eyes and he said, "Oh, how are we supposed to vote on this?" Now, think about that question. How are we supposed to vote on this? So it presumes that there's one way to vote, right? And here's the thing that startled me, that I was more concerned about than his question. And that is that there was an answer. But so is the goal consensus? And what is the goal of a board meeting? And I would say, in terms of the business, it's to deliberate, and ultimately to make a decision. That decision in a healthy organization has consensus, but doesn't have unanimity. Right? So there's room for us to disagree, to speak in favor of, to speak against. Then the board expresses the will of the board. That's more yeses than nos, or more nos than yeses. And then after that, the members of the board align behind the will of the board as expressed by a particular vote. I don't know, Jerry, what do you think? Does that help?
I think too, sometimes we'll reach consensus, and on those items, those should be like the no-brainer, maybe the common sense things that, okay, as the board, we just have to either acknowledge this or, and that's easy. I think the items that we're not going to get consensus on, but we do need to maybe debate or throw back and forth and hear every angle on, those are the tough issues. And that's why it's important to have brilliant minds around the board table who can tackle the tough issues, because that's what the organization needs. And that's why we give more time for those items on our agenda, because we know, man, this is a tough one. And we really need to be thoughtful and take some time and pick it apart from every angle before we try to move forward with it.
And one other thing, let me just mention real quick here, and we're going to go into Q&A here in just a moment. But one of the recommendations that we make in the intentional board is that matters of policy are never acted on at the first meeting they're presented. So, let's say we're going to adopt, or we're going to revise our endowment policy. So that recommendation comes from, let's say, the finance committee, and at the first showing, it's just for discussion. And it's just for deliberation. And we don't have to decide what we think about it, but we just have to start thinking about it. And so we have discussion, and then it's going to be presented for action at the following meeting. And what I found is when we take the pressure of decision-making away, it really inspires people to be more engaged and have some of that. Somebody said, everybody has an opportunity to be heard. We give further thought to it. We bring it back for action later.
Yeah, I think David Hall, his comment is fantastic down here. Goal should be informed decision. Better to have clarity than agreement. And yeah,
Excellent.
Clarity is
yeah. Thank you, David.
Lessons from the Nonprofit Boardroom is on the screen. Dan Busby and John Pearson wrote this book. Another great
Excellent
resource. Kent isn't the only one writing great books on the boardroom. Dan Busby, pretty good too.
Hey, we got another guy in the room today. Jerry Storrs is in the process of finishing a board book, and board book from the Board Guru. Check that out. Jerry, be sure and let us know when it's available. Hey, we reserved a few minutes for Q&A, or question response. And let's see, if you've got one, feel free to drop it in the chat box. We want to respond. Be thinking. In just a moment, we're going to ask everybody to take a moment and share one top takeaway, something from today that you feel like you can put to use in your next board meeting. So who's got the first question? Let's see. And I have a threat. If you don't come up with a question, I'll come up with one, and yours are way better than mine. By the way, Brian, great to see you. All the way from Springdale? You in Springdale today? Awesome. Okay, let's see. I think, was that Eileen's question I saw real quick there? Oh no, Janelle, are there ways to get people to talk more during a board meeting so that you know what they're thinking? Janelle, is this really theoretical? So, one of the things I've used before is a talk ticket. And so when everybody comes in the boardroom, let's say you give every member of the board 2 talk tickets. So when they speak, they give up a ticket. And pretty soon you got somebody that's half of the room's completely out of tickets, and the other half of the room still has tickets. And so that's where you want to reach out. And as Aaron mentioned earlier, a skillful board chair realizes that their job isn't to make decisions, but it's to facilitate the conduct of business. And so that's where we say, I notice we've got a couple of people who haven't contributed to the conversation yet. I want a couple of people who have 2 tickets in their hand. If somebody will, who wants to be the first giving up the next ticket? Okay. And so again, use that to engage people. And one of the things that the board chair, the skillful board chair will do is at the beginning of the meeting is to announce one of the ways I evaluate my success in a board meeting is before we adjourn that we've heard a meaningful contribution from everybody in the room. So part of what I'll be doing is making sure, who was it earlier said in the comments, that everybody's voice is heard one way or another. So that's an invitation for people to engage. Part of the time it's, as Aaron said, some people's disposition is a little bit reluctant. And so part of the time we have to kind of balance that out. The person who, maybe that person who speaks first every time comes up, the board chair says, in just a minute, I'm going to open the floor for comments on the motion. On this time, I'd like to hear from the north side of the room. Something like that.
Yeah. I think culture also, some of those practices will eventually build culture and creating the expectation that everyone's engaged. And that takes time. And those are some good exercises to start building that culture. What is a good way to determine the ideal size of a board?
Hey, Ryan, do you have any easy questions?
Yeah.
Man, that's really a great question. And what I want to suggest on that is begin with purpose in mind. And so somebody said, well, we need to have fewer people because we're having a hard time getting a quorum. Well, the size of the board isn't what makes it hard to get a quorum. It's how many people you have on the board that don't show up, right? So anyhow, what's the ideal size of a board? I'll tell you the simplest approach that I have for that is to identify the number of standing committees you have. So let's just say there's 5. If you have 5 standing committees, you need probably at least 3 different people on each of those committees. So by that definition, you probably need someplace in the range of about 15 people. And what happens oftentimes, I see a board of 12 people and I see 12 committees. You got a problem there. You got a structural problem. So anyhow, easiest solution, what's the right number of standing committees? And by the way, don't count executive committee. That's another topic we can tackle another day. But whatever is the number of our standing committees times 3, that's probably in the neighborhood how many people we want to have on the board.
Got one more. Let's do one more question. This is coming from a CEO who's the sole staff person with the organization. I feel like my board expects me to do everything. That's why they hired me. How do I get them to participate more? And how do I get them to understand what they should be doing?
Wow. I'd go back to those five roles of in an organization. And in the boardroom, in fact, when I do board retreats, I like to put that on and oftentimes, just because I'm a little mischievous, sometimes I'll ask, after we've defined the various roles, I'll ask the CEO to stand. Jan, I don't know if we ever did this together when we were working together, but in the boardroom, board retreat, I'll have the CEO stand and I'll ask for her resignation. And so I'm saying, Jan, would you go on record as resigning from doing the work of the board? And Jan says, oh, you bet. I would be glad to not do the work of the board. And so since she has resigned from doing board work, now she is 100% free to do CEO work. And so then Jan sits down. Now, you know what's next? Ask everybody on the board to stand. And I want the board members to resign, to go on record as resigning from doing the work of the CEO. And so now that I'm free from doing what's not my job, yeah, she's cheering. Now I'm available to do what is my job, and that's governance. And so, Selena, I would say the same thing, and that is to clarify the roles, the distinct roles that belong to each party, and ask each party to stay in their lane now that we've defined it, and give everybody permission to point out, oops, I noticed you swerved a little bit into my lane. And if you'll go back on that side of the yellow line, I'll do the stuff over here. And that way you're going to be free to do the stuff over there. So yeah, so hey, let's real quick. Again, everybody limber those fingers up. We got 47 minutes. We got 3.5 minutes left. In the chat box, what's your most important takeaway today? A point that's useful. Maybe it's a point we haven't made yet. I don't know. Let's see. Somebody says the time to Jen. Hey, Deb, great to see you. Talk tickets. Yeah, somebody else. My board knows how to do this. Yay, Jan. I wonder who trained them. Keep up the good work there. Manage the agenda, not people. Clarifying the roles. Adding time to the agenda. Yeah. Man, we can fill up the entire meeting with just one topic. Being intentional. Clarifying roles. Strive for clarity. Man, you guys, this is good stuff. Hearing everybody's opinions before moving forward with an idea. Yeah. Okay, not acting on policy the first time around. Talk ticket, clarifying roles, managing the agenda. Too much on reports. Silence equals disagreement. I would love to take credit for that, but Aaron, kudos. Law number 18 on the 17 laws.